The emergency room at Meridian General Hospital smelled like antiseptic and dread. David Carter sat in a plastic chair that had gone cold beneath him hours ago. His hands wrapped around a manila folder so tightly that the edges had begun to curl. Inside that folder was everything: his father's medical history, his insurance documents, the referral letter from the family doctor, the results from the preliminary scans. He had organized everything the night before, sitting at the kitchen table under the yellow overhead light, the house quiet around him, in the way that houses go quiet when they've forgotten what it's like to have a woman in them. He had done everything right. He had been careful. He had prepared. And still, 3 hours into this night, he was no closer to getting his father the help he needed than when they'd first walked through those automatic doors. Thomas Carter was 68 years old. He had spent 4 decades standing in front of teenagers who didn't want to be there, teaching them history and civics and, whether they realized it or not, something about what it meant to be a decent human being. He had retired 5 years ago, not because he wanted to, but because his knees had started giving out, and the school board had offered him a package he couldn't afford to refuse. Since then, he'd lived in the same house he'd lived in for 30 years, tending his vegetable garden in the summer, and reading by the window in the winter, and calling David every Sunday evening without fail. He was not a complicated man. He was not a wealthy man, but he was, in every way that mattered to the people who knew him, a good one. David's wife, Sarah, had died 6 years ago. Cancer. The kind that moves fast and doesn't negotiate. They had been married 11 years, and she had been the kind of woman who brought order and warmth to whatever space she occupied, the kind of person who remembered the preferences of everyone she knew and who made it look effortless. Her absence had left a shape in David's life that he'd learned to work around, but never to fill. He had tried, in the years since, to maintain the rituals she had established: Sunday dinners, birthday calls, keeping the house the way it looked when 2 people lived in it rather than one. He had not always succeeded. But the trying was its own form of faithfulness. And his father had understood this without being told. They had leaned on each other in the way that families do after loss, taking turns being the steadier one depending on the week and the weather and whatever small anniversary the calendar produced. He had his father, and his father had him, and that had been enough. Until the previous afternoon, when Thomas had been pruning the roses in his front yard and had simply collapsed. A neighbor had found him, called 911, and by the time David got to the hospital, his father was already in observation, his heart stuttering in ways that the emergency physician said required immediate intervention. Not tomorrow. Not after more tests. Now, there was only one surgeon at Meridian General, with the specific expertise the situation demanded. The attending physician had said her name with a particular kind of reverence, the way people say the names of things they're not sure they deserve access to. Dr. Victoria Hayes. David had nodded like he recognized the name, though he didn't. Not then. He'd gone home to retrieve the insurance documents and the folder and come back, and now he was sitting in this chair, waiting, believing with the uncomplicated faith of a man who has always played by the rules that the system would do what it was supposed to do. He did not yet understand what kind of night this was going to be. Victoria Hayes had been on the cover of 3 medical journals and 1 national magazine in the past 2 years alone. The magazine profile had called her the most technically gifted cardiac surgeon of her generation, a phrase she had framed and hung in her office, though she told people she found it embarrassing. She did not find it embarrassing. She had grown up in a suburb of Philadelphia, the daughter of a cardiologist and a hospital administrator, and she had understood from an early age that medicine was not just a profession but a hierarchy, and that she intended to climb it. She had climbed it. At 44, she was chief of cardiothoracic surgery at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the state. She had published more than 60 peer-reviewed papers, and she had a waiting list for elective procedures that stretched nearly a year. She was extraordinary. She knew she was extraordinary. The problem, and it was a problem that had quietly accumulated in personnel files and hallway conversations over the course of her career, was that she had come to believe her extraordinariness exempted her from certain obligations that applied to everyone else. She was reviewing notes on a procedure scheduled for the following morning when the charge nurse knocked and told her about Thomas Carter. The procedure was a complex aortic valve replacement on a retired federal judge whose insurance was impeccable and whose family had donated significantly to the hospital foundation the previous year. Victoria did not look up from her notes when the nurse spoke. She asked two questions. What was the patient's insurance status, and who was the attending? When she heard the answers, a municipal workers' pension plan, now lapsed, and a second-year emergency physician she'd never bothered to learn the name of. She set down her pen with the careful deliberateness of someone making a point without words. "I have a 7 a.m. procedure," she said. "I need to be rested." The nurse hesitated and told her the attending considered it time-sensitive. Victoria looked up briefly. "Then have cardiology consult and add him to the morning schedule. I'm not doing an unplanned emergency on a patient I've never evaluated based on a referral from someone who graduated 2 years ago." She picked up her pen. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. David had been waiting in the hallway outside the surgical wing for nearly 40 minutes. When Victoria walked past him on her way to the attending lounge, he stood up immediately. He said her name. She slowed, turned, and assessed him in a single practiced glance. The worn jacket, the superstore sneakers, the folder clutched in both hands, and something in her expression closed like a door. She confirmed she knew the case. He stepped forward and told her he understood the procedure was risky, but that he'd read everything he could find. That his father was 68 and otherwise healthy. That he didn't smoke. That he'd been active all his life. She stopped him. She talked about surgical scheduling and resource allocation and the complexity of unplanned emergency procedures. She used the language of medicine the way some people use bureaucracy, as a wall of technical validity behind which the actual decisions live. "There are appropriate channels," she said. "The cardiology team will evaluate him in the morning." He told her his father might not have until morning. The attending physician will monitor him through the night. He opened the folder. "I have documentation, his entire history, a letter from his primary physician who has treated him for 20 years. If you could just, I don't have time tonight," she said. "Speak to the patient liaison in the morning." She walked down the hallway. She did not look back. She turned the corner and was gone. And David stood there with the folder open in his hands, and for a long moment he could not move. When he finally sat back down in the plastic chair outside his father's room, he heard the monitor inside begin to accelerate. That sound, faster, more urgent than before, traveled up through the soles of his feet and settled somewhere below his sternum. He had done everything right. He had been organized and prepared and respectful and clear. He had shown her the folder. He had told her the truth. And she had walked away from his father's file without opening it, without asking a single question, without appearing to understand that the thing in the folder was a life. The nurses who worked the overnight shift on the cardiac observation floor had seen a great many things. They had seen grief and relief, and the particular exhaustion of watching someone you love diminish. They had seen administrators make decisions that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with money. They had seen Dr. Hayes decline to engage with cases before always with reasons that were procedurally defensible and humanly indefensible, and most of them had learned the particular silence that lets you keep your job while still knowing the truth of what you're watching. But tonight felt different. Tonight there was a man sitting in the hallway who had organized his father's entire medical history into a folder, and who held it on his lap like something he was protecting, and the monitor inside room 412 was making sounds that suggested the morning might be too late. Maria Daniels, the charge nurse who had worked cardiac for 11 years, allowed herself to do something she almost never did. She knocked on the door of the residence lounge and told Dr. Aaron Wells, the cardiology fellow who had evaluated Thomas Carter 2 hours earlier, what Victoria Hayes had decided. Aaron Wells was 29 years old and had not yet learned to be careful. He said something under his breath that was not appropriate for a professional setting, pulled on his white coat, and went to look at Thomas Carter's most recent readings. What he saw made him reach for his phone. He called the on-call cardiologist first, to formally escalate the case and request urgent reevaluation. The second call was to a number he'd been given during his residency orientation described as the patient advocacy line. Though everyone on the floor knew it connected to a woman in hospital administration named Phyllis, who had been at Meridian General for 30 years and who had, on at least 2 documented occasions, quietly ensured that certain situations received attention they would not otherwise have received. Meanwhile, David Carter was doing what people do when official channels fail them. He was calling everyone he knew. He called his father's primary care physician, who was sympathetic and helpless. He called a cousin who worked in insurance, who told him there were coverage gaps, but that emergency care was federally mandated regardless of insurance status, which David already knew, and which was apparently not the same as being actionable in the next 3 hours. He called his father's neighbor, who answered in her bathrobe and offered to come, which David told her wasn't necessary. He sat in the plastic chair and he called and he waited. And he watched the door to room 412, and eventually he put the phone in his pocket and put the folder on the seat beside him and covered his face with both hands. He was not a man who cried easily. He had not cried at Sarah's funeral, not in front of anyone. But sitting in that hallway with nowhere left to call, he felt something in him begin to crack along a line he hadn't known was there. He had not yet thought about the fact that his father had spent 40 years in a classroom. He was thinking about something smaller and more specific. A morning, maybe 20 years ago, when he had been failing his junior year history class, and his father had sat across from him at the kitchen table for 3 hours not as a teacher, just as his father, and walked him through everything he'd missed until he understood it. He was thinking about how his father had never once made him feel stupid for not understanding. He was thinking about how rare that was, and he was thinking that a man who had that particular quality was lying in room 412, connected to monitors, and that the woman with the power to help him had looked at his son's jacket and his folder and decided he wasn't worth her evening. In a conference room on the administrative floor of Meridian General, a phone rang. The man who answered it was Richard Holt, 53 years old, chairman of the hospital's board of directors. He was in a late planning meeting reviewing the capital expenditure forecast for the following fiscal year. He answered because the number was Phyllis's extension. And in 30 years, he had never known Phyllis to interrupt a board meeting for a reason that wasn't important. He listened for 90 seconds. He asked one question: the patient's name. When Phyllis said Thomas Carter, the pen Richard Holt was holding dropped from his hand and rolled off the table. The other board members looked up. "I need to stop this meeting," Richard said. There was a 40-year-old memory that Richard Holt carried with him everywhere, the way people carry the things that made them who they are. He had been 13 years old, the new kid at Jefferson High, the son of a man who drank and a woman who worked 2 jobs, a family that moved every time the rent was raised. He had been failing everything. He had been invisible in the specific way that children are invisible when they've learned that visibility is dangerous. And then he'd had Thomas Carter for 10th grade history, and Thomas Carter had done something that no teacher before or after had done. He had noticed him. Not the grades. Not the absences. Him, the person inside the grades and the absences. Thomas Carter had stayed after class with Richard Holt twice a week for an entire semester. He had never asked for anything in return. He had never mentioned it to Richard's parents or the guidance counselor or anyone. He had just looked at this boy who was disappearing into his own circumstances and decided, quietly and without fanfare, that he was going to help him stay visible. Richard Holt had gone on to college on an academic scholarship. He had gone to law school, and then to a career in healthcare administration, and eventually to the chairmanship of a hospital board. And he had never, in 40 years, forgotten the man who had decided he was worth noticing. He made 2 phone calls in the elevator on the way down to the lobby. The first was to board member Dr. Sandra Marsh, a pediatric surgeon whose memory of Thomas Carter involved a particular afternoon when she had been 15 and had decided she wanted to be a doctor and had needed someone to tell her that this was not an unreasonable thing to want. The second was to James Waller, the hospital's CEO, who had not been a student of Thomas Carter's, but who understood, within the first 30 seconds of the conversation, that he needed to be at Meridian General in the next 20 minutes. The cars arrived in the main entrance loop at 11:43. There were 4 of them. The night security guard at the main entrance had worked at Meridian General for 12 years and had never seen the board arrive after midnight. and his expression, as the group moved through the lobby toward the elevators, was that of a man watching something he will describe to his family for the rest of his life. Victoria Hayes was informed of the board's arrival by the nursing supervisor at 11:51. She assumed it had something to do with the federal audit, scheduled for the following month. This assumption lasted approximately 4 minutes, which was how long it took to receive a second call, informing her that the board had gone directly to the cardiac observation floor and was currently standing in the hallway, outside room 412. David Carter heard footsteps and looked up and saw a group of people in business clothes moving down the hallway toward him, with the purposeful, coordinated energy of people who are accustomed to things happening when they arrive. He assumed, in the way of a man who has been told no all evening, that they were coming for some other reason than him. He looked back down at the folder in his lap. "Excuse me." The voice belonged to Richard Holt, who had stopped in front of him. "Are you David Carter? Thomas Carter's son?" David stood. "Yes." Richard Holt looked at him for a moment, with the focused attention of someone recognizing something important. "My name is Richard Holt. I'm the chairman of this hospital's board of directors." He paused. "Your father taught me 10th grade history. He changed my life." In the silence that followed, David did not know what to say. He was aware that his mouth had opened slightly. Sandra Marsh stepped forward. "He was my teacher too, 11th grade. He was the reason I went into medicine." She looked at the folder in David's hands. "Can you tell us what's happened tonight?" David told them. He was precise and organized, because he had always been precise and organized. And because the folder had everything in it that they needed to know. He told them about the attending's assessment, the timeline, the conversation in the hallway. He did not editorialize. He did not perform his distress. He simply told them what had happened. And the people standing in the hallway of Meridian General at midnight listened to every word. Victoria Hayes appeared at the far end of the hallway while David was still speaking. She took in the tableau the board members, the man with the folder, the expressions on faces she had always managed to impress, and something shifted behind her eyes. She had spent her career reading rooms. The room she was reading now told her something she did not like. She introduced herself. Richard Holt turned to look at her with the measured, even expression of a man who has chaired a board long enough to know that what you don't show matters more than what you do. "Dr. Hayes," he said, "we've been made aware of your decision regarding Mr. M. Thomas Carter. We'd like to understand your reasoning." Victoria had her reasoning ready. She always had her reasoning ready. She talked about surgical scheduling and resource allocation, and the complexity of unplanned emergency procedures, and the importance of optimal conditions for outcomes of this type. She was articulate. She was confident. She was, as she had always been, technically impeccable in her self-presentation, but Maria Daniels had walked down the hallway while Victoria was speaking. And she was carrying her phone, and on her phone was an audio recording. Maria had not planned to record the earlier conversation. She had been walking past, had heard David Carter's voice, the particular quality of desperation in it, the careful control of a man trying not to lose his composure, and had, on an instinct she didn't fully examine until later, opened the voice memo application and held the phone loosely at her side. The recording was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. It was clear. When it played in the hallway, Victoria Hayes did not speak. She stood with her hands at her sides and listened to her own voice say, "I don't have time tonight." And then she listened to David Carter's voice say he might not have until morning, and then she heard herself say the attending physician will monitor him through the night. She heard what she sounded like, and she understood, perhaps for the first time, what other people had been hearing for years. James Waller asked for Thomas Carter's file. He read it in silence while the group stood in the hallway, then handed it to Sandra Marsh, who read it more quickly, with the focused efficiency of a surgeon, and when she looked up, her expression had resolved into something definite. "This man needs surgery tonight," she said. She was not asking. She was stating a fact that had apparently been a fact for several hours. She looked at James Waller. "We need to get Dr. Peterson down here." Victoria began to speak. Sandra did not look at her. Dr. Jeffrey Peterson was 61 years old and had been at Meridian General for 22 years. He was not on the cover of any magazines. He had not been profiled in any journals recently. He had a quiet reputation among the nursing staff as someone who answered his own pages and remembered the names of patients' family members. He answered James Waller's call on the second ring, listened to the summary, and said he'd be there in 20 minutes. Victoria Hayes was asked, politely and unambiguously, to wait in a conference room on the surgical floor. She sat in the conference room and looked at the whiteboard and listened to the hospital move around her, and she tried to construct a version of events in which what was happening was not what she understood it to be. She could not construct that version. She had been doing this work long enough to know when a situation had passed the point of management. What she had never had occasion to learn was that behind every person she had declined to treat, there was a folder. Not always a literal one, but an equivalent of it, the organized, careful presentation of a life lived with integrity, assembled by the people who loved the person living it, carried into institutional spaces that were supposed to help, and frequently didn't. She had looked at David Carter's folder and seen insurance paperwork. She had not seen what it actually was. Dr. Peterson arrived at 12:31. He reviewed the file, consulted briefly with Aaron Wells, who had the gratified and exhausted expression of a man who has finally been heard, and spoke with David Carter in the hallway for 4 minutes. He explained what he was going to do, and approximately how long it would take, and what the risks were. He spoke in plain language. He looked at David while he spoke. He answered the questions David asked. Then he went to scrub in. David sat back down in the plastic chair. Richard Holt stayed. He sat in the chair next to David, the two of them side by side in the yellow-white light of the hallway. And after a moment Richard said, "He was the only teacher who ever made me feel like I was supposed to be in the room." David looked at him. "He never mentioned you," he said, which was not what he meant, not quite. What he meant was that his father had never sought recognition for any of it. Richard nodded like he understood the distinction. "That's the kind of person he is," he said. The OR light went on at 12:55. David watched the orderlies move the bed, watched his father's face gray and still, oxygen mask, eyes closed, pass through the double doors and disappear. He watched the doors swing shut. He sat down again. He set the folder on the seat beside him. He put his hands in his lap and looked at the closed doors, and he sat with the knowledge that he had done everything he could and that the rest was out of his hands, which is the hardest thing to sit with of all. He did not cry, and then he did. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The way people cry when they've been holding something for too long, and the holding becomes impossible, a quiet surrender to the reality of how much something matters to you. Richard Holt, who had been in this hospital in various capacities for 15 years, and who thought he had seen most things, sat quietly next to this man he had met 40 minutes ago and did not say anything, which was the right thing to do. On the administrative floor, the investigation had already begun. James Waller had requested the full patient advocacy file on Victoria Hayes. And what he and Richard Holt's assistant reviewed over the next 2 hours was not a surprise. Exactly, but it was a documentation of something that had existed in rumor and hallway conversation for years and had never accumulated into action. 8 formal complaints over 6 years, 6 of them from families of patients who had been deprioritized in ways that, read together, traced a consistent and unmistakable pattern. The files each had the particular texture of institutional language deferral, rerouting, scheduling constraints that could, read in isolation, be explained away, but read together, they told a different story. The patients who had been deprioritized shared certain characteristics: modest income, complicated insurance situations, no obvious institutional connections, no one to call who would be taken seriously. The patients who had not been deprioritized shared different characteristics. The record was clear. It had always been clear. It had simply never been examined all at once, in its entirety, by people who had both the authority and the willingness to act on what they saw. There was a notation in one of the earlier complaint files written by a patient liaison 3 years prior that read, "Referred to department head for review. No further action taken." The patient in that file had been a 62-year-old retired postal worker. The outcome column was blank. James Waller read that notation, set the file down, and sat quietly for a moment before picking up the next one. Somewhere in the accumulated weight of those files was the answer to a question that institutions are often reluctant to ask themselves. At what point does a pattern of individual decisions become a policy? At what point does looking away become a choice? At 3:47 in the morning, the OR light went off. Dr. Peterson came out still in his surgical cap. He looked at David Carter, and he allowed himself a small, tired smile, and he said, "Your father is stable. The procedure went well. He's going to need recovery time, but the obstruction is resolved, and his heart function looks good." He paused. "He's a tough man." David Carter stood up. He put his hand out, and Dr. Peterson shook it, and David said thank you in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to remain functional. Then he sat back down and held his father's folder in his lap and breathed. The board meeting convened at 9 o'clock the following morning, technically later that same morning. Victoria Hayes was present. She had prepared a statement. She read it with the composed precision of someone who has spent a career being the most impressive person in the room and has not yet fully understood that this is no longer the quality the room requires. The board listened. Richard Holt asked 3 questions. How long she had been aware of the insurance coverage issues with the Carter case. At what point she had reviewed the attending's time sensitivity assessment, and whether she was aware of any previous complaints regarding her patient selection criteria. Victoria answered the first 2 questions directly. She hesitated on the third. The file was placed in front of her. She looked at it for a long time. The committee's recommendation, Richard Holt said, based on the documented pattern and last night's incident, is immediate termination of your clinical privileges at Meridian General, pending a full review by the State Medical Board. He let that settle. Then, Dr. Hayes, you are technically one of the finest surgeons this hospital has ever had on staff. That is not in dispute. He paused. But talent without conscience is not a medical asset. It is a liability. Greatness in a single skill does not grant permission to discard the dignity of the people that skill exists to serve. Victoria Hayes said nothing. There was nothing, in the end, to say. She left the building at 10:15, through the side exit off the surgical wing, carrying a box that contained the framed magazine cover, and a coffee mug, and a small plant that had lived on her windowsill for 6 years. The hallway was empty. There was no audience for this departure, which was its own kind of comment on the nature of everything that had happened. Thomas Carter spent 12 days recovering. Dr. Peterson credited his progress to his general health, his history of physical activity, and what Aaron Wells privately described as stubbornness of the best possible kind. Thomas Carter did his breathing exercises and asked questions about his own recovery with genuine curiosity, and said please and thank you to every nurse who came into his room, and the nursing staff visited him slightly more often than was strictly medically necessary. One of the younger nurses, a woman named Leah who was 26 and had been at Meridian General for 8 months, found herself spending longer in his room than her charting schedule technically permitted. She had gone into nursing because her mother had been seriously ill for 3 years, and she had watched the nurses who cared for her and thought, that is the kind of useful I want to be. She told Thomas this on his 3rd day, not entirely sure why she was telling him, and Thomas had listened to the whole story, and then said, "Your mother raised someone who understands that care is a form of strength. That is not a small thing." Leah carried that sentence with her for the rest of the week. Visitors arrived, not in any orchestrated way, but in the organic and slightly overwhelming manner of people who have heard that someone who mattered to them is in the hospital and have felt the uncomplicated human need to be present. Richard Holt came 3 times. Sandra Marsh came once and stayed an hour. And when she left, she was crying in the quiet way of someone who has carried gratitude for a long time and has finally found the right place to set it down. A woman who had been in Thomas's class 35 years ago and was now the chair of the history department at a state university, arrived with flowers and a letter she had been meaning to write for 2 decades. She read it aloud, because Thomas's hands were still slightly weak. And by the time she finished, neither of them was entirely composed. And the window light was the amber of late afternoon, and outside the city was going about its ordinary business without knowing that something was being completed in that room. A man who ran a construction company came and sat for an hour in the vinyl chair and told Thomas that the reason he paid his employees fairly and gave them time off when their families needed them was something Thomas had said in class once about what it means to treat people like they matter. Thomas Carter had not known this. He had known none of these specific things, the specific reverberations of the specific words he'd said in specific classrooms over 40 years. He had simply done his job, every day, with the kind of sustained and unspectacular goodness that doesn't generate incidents because it is not built around incidents. It is built around the individual moments when a person in front of you needs something you have the power to give, and you give it without calculating what you might receive in return. David sat by his father's bed in the evenings and watched the light change through the hospital window and found himself doing a kind of accounting he had never done before. He thought about the folder, still in his bag, and what it had contained, and what it had not been able to do by itself. He thought about what it meant that his father's legacy had been so specific and so durable that it had walked through the door at midnight in the form of the lives Thomas Carter had shaped, those lives now standing in a hospital hallway returning what they owed. He thought about the woman who had left with a box of her things, and he found, to his own mild surprise, that he felt no particular satisfaction about that outcome. He had not come to that hospital to win anything. He had come because his father was in there, and he was afraid, and everything else, the board, the investigation, the institutional reckoning had happened around him rather than because of him. What he had wanted was for his father to be helped. The rest of it was just the accounting that happens when institutions finally do what they were built to do, which they sometimes fail to do until the right people are in the hallway at the right hour, which is itself an argument for building the right relationships over the course of 40 unremarkable years. He thought about what it means to spend your life doing something, the different ways there are to do it. The way Victoria Hayes had done it with extraordinary technical skill and the corrosive conviction that the skill was the thing, that excellence of execution conferred a kind of permission to set aside the human context in which the execution occurred. And the way his father had done it with ordinary dedication and the apparently quite radical belief that every single person who passed through his classroom was worth the same amount of careful attention, not because they all had equivalent prospects, because they were people. And that was the only criterion that had ever mattered. On the day Thomas Carter was discharged, Richard Holt was there. He had cleared his morning. He stood in the room while the discharge paperwork was processed and helped David load Thomas's things into a bag and walked with them to the main entrance. At the door, Thomas stopped and looked at the man who had once been a 13-year-old boy failing everything in a school that was not his first choice and a life that was not the one he would have chosen. He said, with the simplicity of someone who means exactly what he says, "You turned out very well." Richard Holt, who had sat in rooms with senators and negotiated contracts worth figures with many zeros, could not speak for a moment. "You had something to do with that," he said finally. Thomas Carter shook his head. "You had everything to do with it," he said. "I just made sure you could see yourself clearly enough to begin." In the weeks that followed, Meridian General undertook a review of its patient care protocols that James Waller acknowledged, at a staff meeting, was overdue. It was an uncomfortable meeting, the kind where people in the room know they are being asked to look at something they could have looked at sooner and chose not to. New guidelines were implemented regarding emergency care prioritization. The Patient Advocacy Office was restructured with clearer escalation pathways and a formal record-keeping system for complaints that had previously existed in a state of convenient ambiguity. A patient care ethics committee was convened for the first time in 6 years, staffed by physicians, nurses, and 2 external reviewers who had no existing relationship with the hospital's senior leadership. Aaron Wells was recognized for his role in escalating the situation, recognition he accepted with the slightly awkward graciousness of someone not yet comfortable with being seen. He later said, to a colleague over coffee, that he hoped he would not need a crisis to do the right thing the next time, which was perhaps the most honest statement made at Meridian General in that entire period. Maria Daniels received a formal commendation she kept in her locker and did not discuss with anyone, which was consistent with who she had always been. David Carter went back to work. He was a structural engineer, not a famous one, just a good one, the kind who checks his calculations twice, and answers his clients' calls, and does not cut corners, even when cutting corners would be financially convenient. He had learned this from his father, though not in any classroom. He had learned it the way children learn the most important things, which is by watching, steadily and without realizing how much is being absorbed. Over the course of years, he called his father every Sunday evening. They talked about the garden, about the vegetable seedlings Thomas was starting under lights in the spare bedroom, about a book Thomas was reading, about the history of the American highway system, about small and ordinary things that are not small or ordinary to the people who share them. Sometimes they talked about what had happened that night. Not often. Mostly they talked about what was coming: spring, the garden, a trip David was considering, a family somewhere in the city that Thomas had heard about through a former student and wanted to help. Thomas Carter had not become a different person in the hospital. He had not had a revelation or a transformation. He had not emerged from 12 days of recovery with a new philosophy or a changed sense of his own importance. He was the same man who had collapsed pruning his roses. And when he came home, he went back to being that man with the same unself-conscious consistency with which he had always been that man. Which meant, among other things, that he called the principal of a local high school he'd heard was struggling with its history curriculum and offered to consult without compensation. He had seen an article in a local paper about the school's declining test scores and the difficulty of retaining qualified history teachers, and had felt, reading it, the particular restlessness of someone who has a skill that is needed and is not using it. The principal, a 40-year-old woman named Carol Briggs, who had been running the school for 3 years on a budget that made creativity a professional necessity, accepted with the gratitude of someone who has learned to recognize an unexpected gift and to take it before the giver can reconsider. They met the following Tuesday. Thomas Carter brought notes. There are people who spend their careers accumulating credentials and titles, and the specific kind of visibility that comes from being excellent at something the world has decided to reward. They publish and present and win the awards designed for people who do the things they do, and sometimes the recognition is fully deserved and hard-earned, and genuinely meaningful. And there are people who spend their careers doing something quieter, something that doesn't photograph well or translate easily into a professional biography. Thomas Carter belonged to the second category, had always belonged to it, and would belong to it as long as he was alive to help someone see themselves a little more clearly. Victoria Hayes had been technically extraordinary. She had been gifted with a precision that most surgeons spend entire careers pursuing without reaching. She had the publications, and the accolades, and the kind of professional reputation that takes decades to build, and that, once built, feels permanent. What she had not had, and what no amount of precision could substitute for, was the understanding that the person on the table is not a technical problem to be solved, but a human being who has people who love them sitting in plastic chairs in hallways, people who have organized everything carefully into folders because they have learned that the world requires you to be organized, people who are trying so hard to do things the right way in a system that does not always reward people for doing things the right way. David Carter understood this now in a way that was no longer abstract. He had learned it in a hallway, in a plastic chair, at midnight, with a folder on the seat beside him that had not been enough by itself. He had learned it, watching his father be worth remembering, and he understood that these were not the same thing, that being organized and prepared and doing everything right is important, necessary, worth doing, but that none of it had been sufficient, and what had been sufficient was something his father had built over 40 years without knowing he was building anything. There is a difference between being famous and being worth remembering. Fame is a function of visibility, of the particular accidents of timing and platform, and the kind of excellence that lends itself to being broadcast. Being worth remembering is a function of something harder to name and harder to achieve. The quiet and sustained decision to treat the people in front of you as if they matter, day after day, year after year, in rooms where no one is watching and there is nothing to be gained, except the intangible and genuinely valuable thing that happens when a person feels seen. Thomas Carter had never been famous. He had been, for 40 years, absolutely and unmistakably worth remembering. The night at Meridian General had demonstrated this in the most concrete possible terms. The man who had spent his career deciding that every student in front of him was worth his full attention had, in a moment of crisis, been surrounded by people who had not forgotten. That is the return on a certain kind of investment, not a financial return, not a reputational one, not in the conventional sense, but a human one, the most durable kind, the kind that shows up in the middle of the night with car keys and authority, and the memory of a semester 40 years ago that changed everything. David drove his father home. The sun was low in the trees at the end of the street. The particular gold of late morning that makes ordinary things a mailbox, a hydrangea, a driveway look briefly like they are worth more careful attention than they usually receive. Thomas walked to the front door under his own power, which he had been told he could do, and which he fully intended to do, leaning slightly on David's arm but not letting his weight settle there, which was characteristic. He stopped at the rose bushes, which had been tended in his absence by the neighbor who had found him collapsed in the yard. She had deadheaded them and tied back the tallest canes with old pantyhose, the way Thomas had shown her 3 summers ago. "They need trimming," Thomas said. "They can wait," David said. Thomas ran one finger along the edge of a leaf. "Not too long," he said. "A few days," David said. "Rest first." Thomas considered this with the expression of a man who does not fully accept the premise, but recognizes when negotiating will not help him. Then, he went inside. David stood on the path a moment longer, looking at the roses. He thought about the folder in his bag, the folder he had organized at the kitchen table on the night this all began, the folder he had carried through the hospital for hours as a kind of proof, as if a man's life could be summarized in documents, and the documents could be persuasive enough to save him. He thought about what the folder had not been able to do, and he thought about what had done it instead, the particular shape of his father's 40 years, the specific and durable fact of what Thomas Carter had given to people who had then grown into people with the power to give something back. He thought about the midnight arrival of cars and the men and women who had gotten out of them, and he thought that his father had never calculated any of it, had never done any of it for this, and that this was precisely the point. His father had never intended any of it as a strategy. He had not cultivated those relationships as a safety net. He had simply shown up, day after day, and done his work, and treated people like they mattered. And the rest of it, the midnight cars, the investigation, the ending that was also a kind of justice, had been the natural consequence of a life lived in a particular way. Some people spend a lifetime building toward recognition. Others spend a lifetime simply being the reason other people become who they are. The second kind never know the full measure of what they've done. The reach of it extends past what any single person can see. But on a night in Meridian General, in a hallway at midnight, the measure of it showed up in person. It wore business clothes. It had driven through the dark. It remembered a semester in a classroom, 40 years gone, like it was last year, because some things don't diminish with time. They grow. David went inside. His father was already in the kitchen, looking into the refrigerator with the focused intention of a man planning his first real meal in almost 2 weeks. "There's nothing in here," Thomas said. "I'll go to the store," David said. "Get tomatoes, the good ones. I know which ones you like. You always forget the basil." "I've never forgotten the basil." Thomas closed the refrigerator and looked at his son for a moment longer than the conversation required. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up." David looked back at him. "You wouldn't have," he said. Thomas Carter smiled. It was the smile of a man who has lived long enough to know the difference between the things that matter and the things that only seem to. "No," he said. "I wouldn't have. There are people who live their lives building monuments to themselves, awards on the wall, recognition in their field, the satisfaction of being cited and referenced and remembered for the specific thing they were best at. And there are people who live their lives being the reason other people become who they are. The second kind of people leave no monument. What they leave is harder to see and impossible to destroy. It lives in the people they helped, and in the people those people helped, rippling outward in ways that cannot be measured, or mapped, or fully understood. Thomas Carter was not famous. He was something rarer and something better. He was the kind of man the world remembers when it needs to most.